in is just to destroy, to kill the cells that have been infected. So in a sense, you have two different enemies to defeat. The first one is the virus, which goes around copies of the virus that try to reprogram your cells. And you also have to destroy the cells that have been already invaded and reprogrammed. So that's why it is different from a bacterial infection. So in a bacterial infection, you just have bacteria, which are independent small factories, which replicate in your body. And with some chemical and other drugs, such as antibiotics, you can kill them. But they are, let's say, independent, and they operate as single entities. While viruses, let's say viral diseases, are subtler in that they really try to reprogram your own cells. And then it takes the body much more effort to eradicate them.
And I guess what I'm hearing from you then is, if a virus gets into the DNA of the human body, gets into the cell, then rather than being able to use drugs, you've actually got to kill that cell, which is obviously presumably quite destructive for the human body if you start going around killing various cells in the human body.
Yeah, that's correct. So of course, our body has mechanisms to cope with this kind of invasions. So we have what is called an immune system. And the immune system can both, let's say, produce antibodies that bind to circulating viruses, but it can also, with killer T cells, just locate, isolate cells which have been infected or presumably infected, and convince them to commit suicide, essentially, or just eliminate them forcibly if they don't want to commit suicide. So that's how the immune system works. I mean, there are many other things, but the two main branches of the immune system are really about that. One is about tackling and eliminating circulating threats, and the other one is just taking infected cells and bringing them down.
Okay, and why are some viruses? So obviously the conversation today is intrinsically linked to COVID, which why is that particular virus so much more destructive or dangerous then to the human body than a cold is a virus as well, isn't it? So why are some viruses more dangerous to the body?
Right. So essentially, well, I would say that COVID is a relatively mild virus. So there are viruses which can be deadly in like 90-80% of the cases or more. So the problem with COVID is that it spreads very quickly, and of course with just breath and droplets that one spreads around. So it's quite difficult to delimit contagion. And another problem is that, how can I say, so usually we are accustomed to tracking down viruses which are symptomatic. So most of the viruses, what happens is that when you have been infected and you start being sick, you show symptoms, you display symptoms, and then you can be somehow isolated, and so the contagion vector can be stopped. But with COVID, most of the infections are asymptomatic, and so it's quite difficult to understand who is infected at any given moment and to stop all the infection vectors. The other point with COVID is that it is not a natively human infection, human virus. So it's, I think, originally thought it's a bat virus. So it is adapted to bats, where probably doesn't cause any significant infection. The problem is that when moving to humans, COVID has kind of different symptoms. So usually the worst viruses are the ones that have as native species not humans but some other animal. So essentially when they move to human, they are not entirely adapted to the new host. And then you have what is called the zoonosis. So a virus which is native to another species which moves to human, and then it becomes potentially very dangerous because, for instance, COVID can replicate not only in lungs and let's say in the respiratory tract, which is probably what it does in bats, but it can also spread to other human cells, other organs, let's say the brain, for instance, nervous system, but also other organs, major organs. And then it can generate failures of those organs in some individuals. So it depends on the genetic makeup of those individuals and on personal, let's say, reasons. But that typically doesn't happen in bats. So coronaviruses in bats do not have this kind of consequences, systemic consequences in bats. But as COVID is not adapted to humans, it can have this kind of consequences in humans. Usually, the virus doesn't benefit too much from killing its host, so it tends to be as low key as possible. So viruses which are adapted to humans since quite a long time, they don't have this kind of big effects on individuals. So it's a new virus, that's why it's more dangerous.
So the cold virus, for instance, doesn't tend to kill humans, it just makes us sick and then allows us to transmit it to others, therefore propagating its own life. Whereas what you're saying is the COVID virus wasn't designed. It didn't originally design itself to live in humans. So when it got to humans, it suddenly said, well, this is quite exciting. I can start, and it started killing people as opposed to just allowing itself to propagate for longer.
Well, so it's more like that. It's not adapted. Again, all those things. That's an interesting point. Those viruses evolve continuously. In particular, RNA viruses, which are, let's say, blueprints. So they are at the level of blueprints, to use our analogy that we used before. And those viruses make small mistakes every time they replicate, by design, so that they can change slightly and adapt. If they are under pressure, so some kind of evolutionary pressure, or some drug or some vaccine, they can accumulate mutations and try and circumvent these pressures. Essentially, those viruses continuously evolve and adapt, and those viruses evolved to be adapted to bats, their natural host or whatever it is. So they are not adapted to humans, and it takes many years before they adapt sometimes. So they rely on small differences between the different species in order to have mild effects. And let's say if they enter a new species and infect it, it can be that, again, this adaptation is not correct for the new species, and so the effect of the disease is not the same in the new species.
Okay, well, I think we're going to take a short break, if I'm just looking at my producer. We're going to come back straight after this. Now we've had our sort of our biology 101, just the very basics of the human cell. Then the next conversation after the break is going to be, are the vaccines that we're developing going to solve this problem? So, Paolo, thank you for joining us in the first 15 minutes. Stay on the line and we'll reconnect with you in 1 minute's time.
Sure.
Money Sense is brought to you by the Chamber Pension Plan. For further information, visit chamberpension.ky.
The Cayman Islands Chamber of Commerce Pension Plan. We're here for you. Are you aware of the performance of your pension plan? The Chamber of Commerce Pension Plan provides quarterly fund fact sheets for our members to stay informed with the plan's performance. For the year ended August 31st, various life cycle funds provided returns between 9.2% and 16.5%, and our all-in expense ratio is currently the lowest it's ever been, a record low at 0.72%. Visit chamberpension.ky to review our fund fact sheets. You can see the performance as far back as 10 years. Remember that pensions are a longer-term investment strategy. Focus on the long term rather than the short-term returns. The Cayman Islands Chamber of Commerce Pension Plan continues to perform for you. This is Money Sense, bringing an informed financial perspective to the Cayman community. Brought to you by the CFA Society Cayman Islands.
And now, more Money Sense.
Welcome back to Money Sense with myself, Simon Caudry, and our guest this morning, Paolo Rebecca. Dr. Paolo, one of the things we talked about in the first part of the show was just the very essence of the cell, the very essence of how it operates. Now, having listened to you, I'm a little bit scared by the process of cell division and replication mistakes and therefore mutations. So let's talk a little bit about why or how viruses work, and then we'll go into some of the more pressing matters as to will the vaccines that we've developed actually help us solve this problem. So give us a brief primer then on vaccines, how they actually solve this problem that viruses create.
Yeah, sure. A pleasure. So the idea is that, again, we have a powerful weapon to fight viruses and other threats, bacteria as well, and so on, which is called the immune system, which is kind of a programmable army that can get rid of invaders and other threats. Problem is that the immune system has two main ways of working. One is, so it can detect some threats which do not change. So it is programmed to recognize some invaders that we are acquainted to since ages. So some categories, families of viruses or bacteria. But these kind of mechanisms do not change. So there are things such as if there is something weird happening in the cell, some mechanisms are triggered, and the cell eventually gets killed by the immune system. But then there is a much more interesting branch of the immune system, which is the adaptive immune system, which learns from new invasions and new pathogens. And so essentially the immune system can learn to manufacture countermeasures against new invaders that it has not seen before. In order to do that, though, it needs to be exposed to those new pathogens first time. And that's exactly what vaccines do. They teach the immune system to recognize a new pathogen without really having been exposed to it. So that's what vaccines do. Typically use attenuated versions of the pathogen. That's one possibility, so that you don't get the bad side effects of infection, but your immune system can still learn how to fight this new infection. And another possibility, which is what is being doing with COVID, is that you generate some kind of artificial virus-like things that expose parts of the new pathogen of COVID, for instance, in the cell, and so that the cells can learn to recognize them. So again, it's the difference between attenuation of the virus and using an attenuated virus as vaccine, and using recombinant vaccines, which is what I'm hinting at. So vaccines which are designed essentially in the lab rather than being attenuated versions of the pathogen. So all this kind of difference is technical, because I mean, in the end, what we want to do is just have the immune system recognize the pathogen without being having exposed to it before.
And then it's able to produce whatever it produces in order to fight it away.
That's correct. Yes. Okay.
So there's been a lot of debate and a lot of education that people have been going through over the past few months, because we've heard from various drug companies about different types of vaccines. Then there seem to be DNA vaccines and there seem to be RNA vaccines. Help us understand what that difference is, and why it's important to understand those differences.
Yeah, that's correct. So I think it pretty much works as for viruses. So as we said, viruses can try to have different strategies, right? So they can subvert the cell by trying to change the instructions in the control center. So by changing the DNA of the cell, they can try to introduce new blueprints that, rather than making parts for the cell, make copies of themselves. And essentially what they're trying to do here is very similar. So they're trying to induce somehow the cell to produce parts of the viral payload, let's say, that can then be recognized by the immune system. So essentially we're tricking some cells into producing parts of the virus, not necessarily the whole virus, but just parts, so that the immune system can go there and recognize those parts and start fighting them when it really is exposed to the exposure, to the infection. And so in order to do that, we essentially copy tricks that viruses use. So there are DNA viruses which try to replace the code in the control center, and we can use them, so the machinery that they exploit, to make some vectors that generate some COVID proteins, for instance, so that the immune system can come to those cells and learn to recognize those parts of COVID. And so we have DNA vaccines, which typically use this kind of viral vectors, which are DNA viruses without their pathogenic payload. So the payload is replaced with some COVID protein, which is not enough to generate an infection or to reproduce viable COVID viruses, but it's enough for the cell to start producing some of the viral proteins so that the immune system can recognize them. And there are also RNA viruses, which are essentially blueprints for parts, again, of COVID or the pathogen that we want the body to recognize. So in that case, you would have a messenger RNA, which is a single blueprint, which would be, in fact, copied from an RNA virus, which does exactly like that. But again, you replace the payload of the virus, so the part which is able to cause the infection, and let's say which is capable of replicating the virus, and you replace it with some parts of the virus that you want to do a vaccine against, so for COVID. And so what happens is that the blueprint enters the cell. It starts being replicated many times, but rather than generating an RNA virus which reproduces and then starts infecting all other cells, we have a crippled, let's say, version of the virus which just generates COVID proteins, and then those can be recognized by the immune system, and they teach the immune system to recognize COVID. So let's say you are using a few cells because the dose of the vaccine is limited, and you convert them into factors that produce COVID proteins so that the immune system can be alert and learn to recognize them and fight them in the future.
Okay, so now I've got to be a degree of optimism. We've got these viruses which can help fight these. Sorry, we've got these vaccines that can help fight these viruses, help the human body recognize the virus before it gets in, produce the stuff that it needs to fight it. But then there's this anxiety, and we've got only a few minutes left in the show. But we then have this anxiety about mutations. How worried should we be about that and the ability of vaccines to solve this problem that we face?
Right. So, well, there is an issue there. So I think those concerns are partly justified in that, I mean, of course, so coronaviruses are tough because they can mutate quite easily. So they have quite a good capacity for mutation and circumvent vaccines and other things. And of course, so what has been done so far is remarkable in that in a few weeks, new vaccines have been designed, engineered, and produced massively to start fighting this infection, so this outbreak, pandemic of COVID. But the problem is that eventually those viruses, and in particular RNA viruses such as COVID, so blueprint viruses, let's say, viruses that introduce their own blueprint and use the cell to replicate it, are able to mutate and adapt to all pressures, including new vaccines. But so let's say there is some kind of war between scientists and the virus. So the virus will mutate, which is what it always does. I mean, it's a very common strategy that all RNA viruses use. So there's nothing new there. And then there are different ways of making vaccines. Some ways are more straightforward. And of course, these first generation vaccines that we have now use the simple strategy to fight the virus. On the other hand, there are more sophisticated ways of making vaccines. And that's what we are working on at the moment. So we are trying to create vaccines that are able to target the virus irrespective of how many mutations it accumulates. So in a sense, it was expected perhaps that first generation vaccines would not entirely solve the problem, but we are definitely working on finding better ones that, let's say, after this first phase can eradicate, hopefully, the virus forever.
So if I understand you correctly, what you're saying is that this first generation of vaccine development, in a sense, will buy us time to allow us to create different vaccines which will be more comprehensive in their ability to prevent mutating versions of this COVID virus. Is that fair to say?
That's exactly correct.
Do you think we'll succeed in and yes or no sort of question here, I'm afraid, but do you think we'll succeed in buying ourselves enough time before we have a 4th or 15th or 25th wave of this thing?
Hopefully, yes. So again, there are many people working on that. Unfortunately, again, I think the magnitude of the threat is a bit unprecedented. So it took quite some time to politicians and the system to react to this problem. But I think we are gearing up, and so now more of the things that are important are starting to get known. So, and people are getting convinced that we have to be a little bit more incisive and decisive. So hopefully we'll get all the funding and the money which is necessary to develop this second generation vaccines and solve the problem.
Well, Paolo, you have left me with a little bit of hope, which I'm pleased about. There is always the worry, and I suppose, and we've run over time here, and I'm going to apologise to the producer straight after this. But I think the worry, of course, is that we saw some of this in the SARS outbreak and the MERS outbreak, where the enthusiasm to donate money to causes to solve it suddenly starts to wane when it doesn't seem like it's such a big problem anymore. So that's, I suppose, the anxiety from a scientist's perspective.
Absolutely, so you're completely right. It's always difficult to convince people that these kind of problems are important when there is no immediate threat.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, there are many viruses around. Many of them, as I said before, are even much more lethal than COVID.
Let's not talk about more lethal viruses. I want to leave on a happy note.
Very well funded.
I want to leave on an optimistic note, Paolo. I don't want to hear about more lethal viruses right now.
No, right.
No, but look, in all seriousness, thank you very much for joining us on our show this morning. Appreciate your patience with my rather ignorant questions about the essence of biology. I know our listeners will appreciate your educational perspective on this, and I sincerely wish you luck in your research and hope that round 2 of these vaccine developments succeeds and you get the funding that the industry needs to help humanity get through this. So thank you again, Paolo.
Thank you very much, Simon. Bye.
Bye-bye. So thank you very, very much then to our listeners. Remind you, Money Sense will be available for viewing on our website, and in 2 weeks' time we will have an election special. So Money Sense will be back in 1 month's time. With that, thank you and apologies for running over. Goodbye.
Money Sense is brought to you by the Chamber Pension Plan. For further information, visit chamberpension.ky.
The Cayman Islands